What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical average American, here today to react and learn about every single Canadian Prime Minister ever. That's right, strap in, folks, buckle your seatbelts, because we are gonna be here for a while, kick back. But you know what? This is finally a topic where I am not at all embarrassed to admit that I don't know anything about the Canadian Prime Ministers, and you know what? That's okay. If there's any Canadians out there who know all of the United States presidents, I concede to you. You know what? You win this one because I don't know anything about. I couldn't even name all the United States presidents between you and me. I think there's 46 U.S. presidents, only 23 Canadian prime ministers, and I really don't know much of anything about any of them. Even the one prime minister I do know, at least Justin Trudeau, which most Americans I think could at least name his name. That's about where my expertise on the subject ends. So I'm actually very interested today to learn from JJ here, who is going to explain a little bit of the history and the accomplishments of all the Canadian prime ministers. He's also going to rank the prime ministers in some kind of ranking, which I don't know exactly what criteria he's going to use to do that, but you know what? Why not throw in a little controversy here and there? You know, should make things a little fun. Let's just start ranking the prime ministers. Why not? That should be interesting as well, honestly. So without any further ado, let's get started. Canadian prime ministers.
So we're going to start our list in the year 1867. That was the year that the current Constitution of Canada was adopted, and the year that most people think Canada became a country in the modern sense. And the first prime minister of that new country was a guy called John Alexander Macdonald.
John Alexander Macdonald. I say that like I know anything. I've heard this name. I've learned a little bit of Canadian history here and there. Not all of it sticks. This name stuck. That's about where it ends. John A. Macdonald.
In Canada, he is always referred to as John A. Macdonald, or sometimes Sir John A. Macdonald, because he was knighted by Queen Victoria.
Really?
Macdonald is an incredibly famous guy in Canada, probably the one historical prime minister you would expect everyone to know. A lot of people think of him as the founder of Canada.
He's literally I don't want to make comparisons here that make no sense, but he sounds like kind of the Canadian version of what Americans we would have George Washington, basically. The first dude. That's a technical term right there. First dude.
And a kind of Canadian George Washington. An analogy that Macdonald encouraged in his own time and even got paintings of himself done to look like him. So
wait, that's kind of scary. I was just talking about this. All right, there you go. I guess it is a fair comparison.
So what did he do? Well, Macdonald was a big shot politician from the Conservative Party in the previous Canadian government, and he was one of the architects of the new constitution that went into effect in 1867. This new constitution expanded Canada's borders to create an American-style federation with other British colonies in North America, and Macdonald is seen as being at the center of all of the wheeling and dealing it took to set that up.
I don't think I'm talking out of school here by saying this sounds like some pretty amazing, really good Canadian accomplishments so far. Really great.
As we can see in this patriotic educational video.
And the time for union is now. I ask you to take the dare.
Ooh, I like this.
Macdonald was then elected to lead that new government he helped create, and he ruled Canada for nearly 20 unbroken years. His long administration is most notable.
Ruled Canada. Is that choice of words on purpose? He ruled Canada? Makes him sound like a king or something.
Ruled Canada for nearly 20 unbroken years.
20 years, being in charge. I wonder if at that point there was any sort of election process. Maybe that's has something to do with that?
His long administration is most notable for annexing all of this additional territory, as well as spearheading the creation of a tremendous transcontinental railroad to tie the country together with a ribbon of steel.
Wait, he also did the big Canadian transcontinental railroad that I have heard about at some point as well. These are like, sounds like he actually did like a lot of really important feats.
As the romantic phrasing of the time put it, MacDonald was briefly out of power from 1873 to 1878, when his government was voted out following various scandalous revelations about corruption between his political party and the big railroad companies.
Oh, geez. Well, you know what? That's like a good sign, honestly, because it answers my question. Like, he was voted out, or at least his party was voted out, and he was brought out of the position of prime minister, which means that, like, some kind of democratic process was taking place, so that's good.
His place, Canadians elected their first ever Liberal Party government, headed by a similarly named guy called Alexander Mackenzie. Mackenzie is not very well remembered today, and most of the things he did during his one and only term were things that MacDonald was in the process of doing anyway. Like
Alexander Mackenzie, I've never heard of him. Apparently, a lot of Canadians haven't either. Strange anecdote, but he looks a lot like Abraham Lincoln. I don't know. That came to my mind.
Like creating a Canadian Supreme Court or passing the infamous Indian Act that established Canadian Indians as a separate class of citizen. The callous way...
Oh, jeez. Oh, no. So this guy was just, like, randomly prime minister for 5 years in between John A. MacDonald. Checking my notes here. John A. MacDonald, yes, that's who it was.
In which the early Canadian prime ministers treated the native peoples of this country is something that is becoming an increasing source of controversy as of late, and has led many people to argue that we should probably stop venerating our early leaders quite so much. But that said, just in terms of how important John A. MacDonald was as a historic figure in helping form the Canadian Constitution and laying the groundwork for the continent-sized country that Canada is today, he would historically be considered one of Canada's S-tier prime ministers.
I was gonna say, this is fun. He's doing a tier system. S is the best, F is the worst rating. And John A. MacDonald, I was gonna say, if anyone gets like S tier, the best rating possible, sounds like he would, like honestly.
Alexander Mackenzie, by contrast, is mostly forgotten and undistinguished, so he is probably best placed in the C tier. MacDonald died in office in 1891, and 4 different men each briefly served as prime minister in the 4 years that followed. John Abbott, John Thompson, Mackenzie Bowell, and Charles Tupper.
Wait, they all served like 1 year?
In the 4 years that followed. John Abbott, John Thompson, Mackenzie Bowell, and Charles Tupper.
Yeah, it was like, not all of them served 1 year each. It was kind of a mishmash of random amounts of time, but it makes me wonder, how can there really be any... did any of them have any opportunity to do anything notable, like, in that short amount of time?
MacDonald was such a domineering personality that it was considered quite difficult to find a good replacement for him within the Conservative Party after his death. These 4 guys are thus just mostly known for symbolizing this politically chaotic time and accomplished virtually nothing of note.
There you go. That's exactly, like I was gonna say, 4 people in 4 years. What could it possibly... anything productive could have happened? Sounds like no.
They're all F tier. In 1896, the last of these guys, Charles Tupper, a man who was only in office for 2 months, was defeated in an election by the Liberal Party led by Wilfrid Laurier.
This is so fascinating. Like, and it's so different than American history, which I am going to draw some comparisons here, being that I am American. Can't help it, but all these prime ministers, some of them were prime minister for 1 year. This guy was prime minister for like 2 months, I think he said. It's so different than the United States, because presidents, I think every president except Richard Nixon served for at least 4 years. You know, the minimum amount of time that an American president can have the office of president. So all these like 1 year or less timetables for prime ministers is very like new to me.
Laurier is considered another one of the very major figures of Canadian history. And
he's a major figure, not fissure, figure, so I should know his name. Wilfrid Laurier.
Probably the only other S-tier prime minister. He ruled for 15 years, and his government is associated with settling all of this empty land that Macdonald had annexed, as well as presiding over Canada's growth into one of the major industrialized countries of the world.
Wow.
Gold mines and wheat farms and lumber mills and so on. I made a whole separate award-winning video about Laurier's prime ministership. You should...
Oh, wow. I have never heard of him. That might give you an idea of, like, I imagine, just based on these accomplishments, he's very, very well known in Canada. But to give you a frame of reference, I've never heard his name ever before.
Should really check out. It's one of my favorite videos I've ever made. Laurier was in turn defeated in the 1911 election by Conservative leader Robert Borden. Today we associate Borden mostly with Canada's participation in the First World War, which to this day is still something that is quite heavily sentimentalized as a time in which Canada sort of really made itself known as a powerful, serious country on the world stage, and not simply a wimpy British colony. So he would be...
Yeah, there's actually a lot of stuff about Canada and the World War that I have wanted at some point to, like, get more into that. More of that history of Canada. There's a lot of interesting stuff, I believe.
Considered an A-tier prime minister. After 2 terms, Borden retired while still in office and was replaced as prime minister in 1920 by Interior Minister Arthur Mahan. Mahan had been Borden's right-hand man and was this very strident right-wing character who was very down on immigrants and labor unions and stuff. But we never really got to see how he would have handled the top job, because after just a few months in office, he was voted out in favor of the Liberals under William Lyon Mackenzie King.
Okay, I am, like, just confused now about, like, the Canadian election cycle. Because this is, like, several times now where there are Canadian prime ministers being voted out of office within a matter of months. How is that possible? How often are the elections held for this kind of thing? Or, I mean, if I'm really racking my brain here, really trying to... I mean, the prime minister is the leader of the majority party in Canada. I'm not even going to look this up. I'm just going to trust... my brain. I think it's the leader of the majority party in Canada. So are elections for party members going on, like, throughout the year, so that majority party can change, like, a little kind of frequently? Is that fair at all to say? Therefore, changing who the prime minister is? That's all I got.
And was thus a very transient and irrelevant prime minister who has to be put in the Fs. Mackenzie King, by contrast, was the longest-serving prime minister in Canadian history.
Really?
Almost 22 years,
22 years! This is crazy, hearing this as an American. We got prime ministers in for 2 months? We got prime ministers in for 22 years? This is just madness! I mean, it's not, but, you know... From my American frame of reference, this is just all over the place. We're so used to presidents, 4 years, then they can have a second term if they're elected again, 8 years maximum, then they can never be president again. And any more than 8 years, and Americans are kind of programmed, like, to be like, hey, they shouldn't be allowed in office longer than 8 years. That's madness. But honestly, when you think about it, if you had a leader that was the best possible, this is a perfect situation, I guess, and I don't know how perfect William Mackenzie King was, but if he was very good, then I could see why you would want someone who's literally perfect for the job doing the job for 20 plus years. Like, why would you not want just someone who's doing a great job, and that most people agree with that sentiment? So, yeah, it's just funny little side anecdote there, thinking about how anything over 8-year terms in office, and my brain is just like, whoa, what's going on here? This ain't right.
You mush all of his dates together. And accordingly, he is associated with a great many important things, as you might expect for someone who hung around for so long. He'd go in the A tier with Old Man Borden. King negotiated Canada's final independence from Great Britain in 1931, and he laid the...
That's kind of important. Kind of important.
Foundation for what we would now think of as the modern welfare state, introducing innovative social programs like old age pensions for seniors. However,
Okay.
in the height of the Great Depression in 1930, he was briefly voted out in favor of R.B. Bennett. Bennett was a wealthy conservative lawyer, and many historians believe he was a man woefully miscast to run Canada during an unprecedented period of poverty and unemployment. The standard argument is that he did not really grasp the full magnitude of the Depression, and it took him way too long to realize the sort of dramatic government action that would be needed to resolve it. Though he
That's really unfortunate, huh? When there's like that much of a disconnect, because at the end of the day, government is there to serve the people and the good of the people. That is literally its purpose. So to have a prime minister elected into office that's not really aware of what's needed and in what time frame for the good of the people who are suffering from a depression in Canada, that's sad to hear about.
He does have his defenders. He is quite widely regarded as having been a failed prime minister. So let's put him in the D tier.
Yeah.
Mackenzie King was elected back to power in 1935, while Bennett lived the rest of his life in exile in Great Britain. King's final terms are associated with Canada's entry and participation in World War II on the side of the Allies. This is another very sentimentalized period of Canadian history that's considered quite a heroic time for the country.
Again, this is something I'd like to learn more about. This feels like it really deserves its own video dedicated to Canada and the World Wars.
And has helped further consolidate King's A-tier reputation. I actually made a whole other award-winning video about King that you can watch as well. King finally retired in 1948 and was replaced by the man who had been his Attorney General, Louis Saint Laurent. Prime Minister Saint Laurent is mostly forgotten about today, but he was quite important for presiding.
He's forgotten about. He was prime minister for 9 years.
Over Canada's big post-war economic transformation. Throughout the 9 years he was in charge, the country continued to industrialize at quite a rapid clip, developing large multinational...
Maybe he's kind of forgotten, quote-unquote forgotten, because it was right after the World War had ended, in a time, like, everyone's literally, like, letting out a sigh of relief, rebuilding, regrouping, and kind of a happier kind of time. So there wasn't so many huge issues like World War for him to have to deal with. Maybe that's a reason why he's not as known.
Multinational corporations, powerful banks, and a mighty oil industry, all of which helped further establish Canada as one of the world's major capitalist powers. He didn't achieve anything particularly epic, but was a mostly popular and competent leader. So
hey, say no more. He's one of my favorites now. We're talking capitalism. My American little radar went off. Capitalism. He established capitalism and oil, money in Canada. He's S tier. He's the best. I don't know. Sounds like he did a good job.
So he'd be in the B tier.
All
He
right.
did lose his bid for a third term to Conservative John Diefenbaker, however. Diefenbaker remains a pretty famous prime minister today, in part because he had such a memorably quirky name and a rather flamboyant and eccentric personality.
All right.
Dief would also be considered a man who presided over Canadian good times in the late 50s and early 60s. And for
There you go. Perfect way to say it. There are certain prime ministers who resided over Canadian good old times. So there's not as much opportunity to make your mark, but it's like also a great thing when you're in that kind of time as well.
For a while, he was quite popular because he was seen as this very good, upright, Christian sort of guy. But he also came to be seen as someone who just made a lot of bad decisions in Canadian foreign and military policy during the early years of the Cold War, and someone who just led a fairly disorganized administration more broadly. So he'd be in the C tier. Diefenbaker was voted out in 1963 in favor of...
Oh, I might stop it right there. Yeah, I'm gonna stop it right there. Okay, you know what? Before we hear about the next prime minister, my goodness, we've gotten through like, I don't know, at least like almost 10 so far. Pretty good. But this video, I mean, we're not even hardly halfway done, which I'm actually excited about because I'm really enjoying this so far. I'm really enjoying learning about the history accomplishments of the Canadian prime ministers throughout history. I have never heard of any of these gentlemen in my entire life. I can say that much. So this is all new to me and all very enjoyable. So I'm going to stop for now and pick up the second half of this in part 2, which will come out after this video. So if you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like or leave a comment, perhaps on your opinion on who you like best throughout history in terms of Canadian prime ministers that were covered here today. And if you're interested in part 2, or just more videos like this in general, me talking about and learning about Canada and Canadian culture, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.